We are ready, I think, to go on to our next speaker. We are going to do this back to back, and we'll take a coffee break after the next speaker. And we are now going to take a look at the problem from the China perspective, but a little different from the talk you just heard on the India perspective. This is not a macro view of China's engagement with climate change, but a somewhat more specific look at how China can be part of the solution to the problems of climate change. And we're delighted to have as our speaker Professor Shameen Prashantham, who is a professor of international business and strategy at the China-Europe International Business School, which is the top business school in China. He works on, or has worked on in the last several years, the idea of large companies partnering with small companies, including startups, and to see how large companies can leverage the innovations and ideas of small companies. And that has led him to also work on this topic of climate change, because a lot of the smaller companies and innovative startups in China are working on climate tech. So what he's going to talk to us about today is how Western companies need to engage with Chinese, both the Chinese market and the Chinese companies and their technologies in order to help address the climate change challenge at a global level. And this, given the geopolitics of the moment, we know this is going to be difficult, but what Shameen will argue, I think, is that we have to still find a way to address the opportunities and a way to manage the risks rather than to decouple. And so with that, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Shameen. And Shameen, again, I know it's even later for you in the day than it was for Arunabha. I think it's 10:30 p.m. or something like that in Shanghai. Very much appreciate your making time so late in the day. Welcome, and over to you.
Ravi, thank you very much. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, that's perfect. That's great. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. When the previous Q&A was going on, I got a glimpse of the room. I can see it's full. So it's wonderful to have this chance to join you from Shanghai. So here, in taking this China perspective, exactly as Professor Ramamurthy said, I'm actually coming at this from someone who's been interested in inter-organizational partnerships for many years, and particularly the sort of asymmetric relationships between large and small companies. And so I'll just very quickly go through a few slides by way of some background, and mainly to set the stage in terms of my not being a sustainability expert in particular, but rather someone who came at this more from the perspective of partnerships. But when I was doing this research, I came across the work of Paul Polman at Unilever and was fortunate to also exchange ideas with him. And he was extremely supportive of this idea, not only from the point of view of driving innovation, but more generally in terms of the prospect of partnerships between non-traditional allies contributing to the Sustainable Development Goals. And on the next slide, you will see a quote which was part of an endorsement he very kindly gave. It was, which says, "It is imperative for large organizations to partner with more nimble startups to help create a better world." And that really plugs into this idea that partnerships matter as a broader force for good, strongly connected with the Sustainable Development Goals. In fact, as you'll see on the next slide, the 17th of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is partnerships for the goals. And that's the broader context in which my work has been moving. The company I spent the most time and effort studying was Microsoft. And in fact, in 2020, just before COVID was declared a pandemic in March, at the end of February, they announced a particular initiative, as you'll see on the next slide, focusing on social entrepreneurship. Now, social entrepreneurship, the SDGs, they cover a broad range of issues, of course, but one that has been gaining more and more importance and traction is climate change. Some of the examples that I came across as I started looking more and more about how partnerships can impact on climate change, as you'll see on the next slide, relate to matters like health. So for example, that first example of Cloud Physician is a Bangalore-based startup that provides digital solutions for intensive care units in hospitals. And when India had a horrible second wave of COVID in around April, May 2021, they had a very big role to play in partnership with Cisco. Kusini is a South African startup that deals with clean water, and in partnership with DHL, they help to get clean water to some hard-to-reach places in South Africa. But the theme of this session is more along the lines of this final example, which is about climate action. And Meetero is a Chinese startup that AB InBev, the company that makes Budweiser, started working with in China with a view to turning some of their waste materials into recyclable material. And so in that broader context of looking at how companies that have not traditionally worked together, now we may be taking it for granted, but when I started my research almost 20 years ago, examples of big companies and startups working together were few and far between. And that last example of a Western multinational working with a Chinese startup with the potential for arriving at innovation that helps drive climate action is what turned my attention then over these past 3-4 years. In fact, starting about 2020. So when COVID was still an issue, this is when the research about this China angle in terms of climate change became more salient for me. Now, this is a collaboration with a McKinsey consultant, so this has been also very interesting and educative for me to try to bring in the perspective of an academic with that of a consultant. And so let me get to the meat of the presentation and move to the next section, which is on China and climate change. So in some ways, the argument is relatively straightforward, and it really came home to me that something interesting was happening towards the end of September 2020. Now, this was COVID times, and I think the United Nations General Assembly met for the first time virtually. And I think the next slide has a picture. This is just the article that was written up, the Prashantham and Wetzel piece, to create a greener future, the West can't ignore China. So that's the broad overall message. And the interesting thing about working with Harvard Business Review is they never accept the title that you come up with, but always come up with one themselves. And so this was their suggestion of what the overall message is. Anyway, moving on to the next slide. So towards the end of September 2020, when the United Nations General Assembly met virtually, I think for the first time, President Xi made this momentous announcement that China would aim to peak its emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Now, in Europe, 2050 is the preferred target, and I'm sure there are some who would wish that China would get there sooner. But given that it's the largest carbon emitter in the world, even this is relatively ambitious, and so generally was welcomed, I think. And so that was the point, actually, when I started paying more and more attention to what was going on. And it seems to me that there's both an opportunity, but also highly or perceived risks that seem to be at play. And so it's important to take both of these together. So as we move to the next slide, you will see that, first of all, the opportunity is large, and both in terms of China being an adopter of climate technology, but also a developer of climate technology. And this is really driven to a large extent by these twin goals of peak emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2060. Of course, the focus on renewables like solar was already well underway by then. In fact, I would say by 2020, China was already pretty dominant. Also, by then, there had been a lot of work that had gone into electric vehicles, but this just gave renewed momentum. And I think it's important to understand within the broader context of China, the big macro-environmental shifts that happened around then, the autumn of 2020. So when this announcement was made by the end of September 2020, the world was about 6 months into a pandemic that had, the World Health Organization, I think around the 11th of March, had declared COVID to be a pandemic, whereas in China, this had become a major problem from about the Chinese New Year holidays in late January. Those of us expats based in China, many of us had traveled outside for Chinese New Year, decided not to come back immediately, and in fact ended up getting stuck for several months before getting back. But by this point, end of September, actually people were not wearing masks here anymore. And there was a sense in which COVID had been suppressed. And the government was making some very significant, bold moves and making some important signals. One of them is this, but also within less than a month from this announcement, there were also big shifts in other sectors of the economy where it began to be clear that the government was less interested to support. I think most famously, the following month when Jack Ma made a speech being a bit critical of the government, the IPO of the finance arm of Alibaba and Financial did not go ahead. So that sent chills for sectors of the economy that had done extremely well, such as big tech. And so climate now became one of the important favored sectors. And so going forward, there has been a lot of momentum. And, despite some concerns about, the extent to which there is coal-powered energy being used, etc., by and large, there's generally been momentum around clean tech. So over these past 4 years, for example, many of my former students who are interested in entrepreneurship have dialed down their ambitions in terms of digital tech more generally, unless it's much more sophisticated and into AI or into hardware like semiconductors. But where there's been a lot more interest and promise and greater access to financial resources has been climate tech. So in that sense, there has been momentum. But then it's not as if everything that is relevant comes from China itself. There's also been interest in the technology of foreign companies. So a twofold opportunity from the perspective of Western companies, which is to sell into China, but also potentially see what's going on in terms of innovation. But the world also has been a very different place in the post-COVID era. I would say from 2018 already, we were beginning to see some sort of a move towards reducing the dependence of the West on China, particularly the US. I think the speech by Mike Pence in October 2018 was a very clear signal of that. But in the meanwhile, also here in China, from 2018 onwards, there were some clear internal changes as well, greater assertion by the Communist Party, greater centralization of party. And I think these things happening in parallel, we were beginning to see now tensions in terms of trade, eventually tensions in terms of tech, and then in the after COVID struck, that became even more pronounced. What I think was also particularly unfortunate is that there was lack of person-to-person connectivity. People could not travel. I mentioned that expats like myself, we were stuck outside. Getting back into China was very difficult. And once you got back in most cases, you didn't want to leave because when you came back, you'd have to quarantine for 2 weeks and so on. And it just did not make any sense for international executives to fly into China as they used to. And in this process, I think the perceived risks increased greatly. I think for many Western companies, there were international stakeholders who were beginning to question why bother when it is so difficult to engage and when there's a lot of nervousness about this from a geopolitical point of view. But also here in China, there's been a lot of pressure as well. Companies have felt as if there's been more demands on them, for example, willingness to share data and things like that. But the other side of the story is competition has also risen. In many sectors, actually, Western companies will acknowledge that Chinese companies have caught up. But when it comes to climate tech, there's a perception that, in fact, Chinese companies are ahead. So in that context, then, the meat of the argument in the paper, as you will see on the next slide, is what is then important is for companies to think of ways in which to engage, which take into account both the opportunities and the risks, and recognize that these are both global in the sense that when you're an international company dealing with China, you have to take into account that global character of the company. You have international stakeholders or stakeholders back home who are worried about what you're doing, but also there's the reality of what's happening on the ground. And so that sort of lends itself to 4 broad strategies that we talk about in this Harvard Business Review paper. The first is, given that there's a gender perception from a global perspective about the risks of engaging with China, think about sustainability as a global theme for the company, which means that engaging with China is only natural. The second strategy, again, relating to risks, is look for safety in numbers in dealing with China, and look for ways in which to find safe spaces in which to operate. But then, from a positive point of view, given that there are clearly opportunities, forge partnerships with local companies for market access. And then fourthly, and the thing I want to dwell on a little bit, is access innovation from China. So just to quickly mention maybe some examples of each in terms of sustainability being a key theme. Actually, even a company like Apple, which isn't a climate tech company at all, has been very consistent in its messaging about sustainability and that this is global. And their sustainability report makes for fascinating reading. And the things that they do in different parts of the world, in South America, around rainforests, for example, but also in different other parts of the world, which means that it's only natural then that in China, where the bulk of their global value chain lies, the supply chain lies, it's only natural that they would be doing a lot of things related to climate. Of course, even they have faced pushback and about being super reliant on China. They're now diversifying into other economies, but China is going to remain very important for them. And as long as sustainability is part of their broad global perspective, it's only natural that they would engage with China. But an even more striking example for me, and this came courtesy of my McKinsey co-author, because I think they were doing some work with this company, a small company called Lanza Tech in Smoky, Illinois, I think just outside Chicago. They have some very cool technology that is of great interest to oil and gas companies around the world because they help to convert ethanol into more climate or sustainable materials. And they work with Indian Oil Corporation in India, but they also work with Sinopec in China. And in fact, they attracted Sinopec to be one of their strategic investors. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if there are some people among their local stakeholders in America who've raised eyebrows, but then China is just part of a bigger story. And I think that seems to be one way in which companies are better able to deal with the risks that are perceived at home, never mind the reality on the ground in China. So now moving to the next point, though, it is very understandable that companies do want to feel more reassured in terms of doing business in China, in terms of the pressures they may face, the pressures on intellectual property. And so here, forming or joining coalitions is important. The notion is basically that of seeking safety in numbers. And what may not be very clear from the outside is the progress that has been made in terms of coalition building. Either coalitions that have been initiated by Western companies like Microsoft, for example, they have an alliance that they've invited Chinese universities like Tsinghua to join. There's another initiative that McKinsey was involved in helping to orchestrate, which basically has a pledge for buying climate or guaranteeing that they will buy carbon capture-related technology. Excuse me, if you don't mind, just stay on the previous slide, and I'll quickly finish that and then move on to this. So here I'm on the second strategy. The point I'm making is that there are coalitions in place that one can join. Tencent has created one, which, again, Microsoft has joined. So this idea of safety numbers is important, but even LanzaTech, the small company from Illinois that I mentioned, one of the things that they've done, which is interesting, is they don't just have Sinopec as their partner. They also work with some Chinese steel companies. And so it's not as if they're dependent on this one strategic partner. They have brought together a group of 4 or 5 companies with whom they are doing this jointly. And also they've been very clever in terms of the way in which they've dealt with their intellectual property. They only have a licensing deal so that they can tightly control their IP, and they have first rights to any new IP that is developed in these partnerships. The third strategy, forging partnerships with local companies for market access, might sound like a throwback to the 1990s, which is when Western companies were going into China with joint ventures. But I think what's different now is that there is access to a Chinese diaspora, highly qualified people in the West who actually can be part of the companies themselves and play an important bridging role. I can say more about that in due course. But the final point I really want to say more about is recognizing that China has some interesting innovation that can augment what Western companies are doing. And so now, in that context, if I move to the next slide, one of the interesting companies out of Silicon Valley, although it has roots in New Zealand, is a shoe company called Allbirds that uses purely sustainable materials. They've been under some pressure now financially, from investors and so on, having gone IPO in 2022. But it does have, its loyal brand supporters who appreciate the fact that this company is really trying to take an everyday ordinary product like shoes and use highly sustainable materials like sugarcane for soles, etc. Now, while operating in China, they collaborated with NIO, the electric vehicle company, which is doing multiple innovations, not just in terms of battery technology and so on, but also just in simple things like materials that they use for their interiors. And so they combined with NIO to use some of the materials that NIO had developed to create a very special, limited edition version of the shoe. And from the Allbirds perspective, this was interesting because they felt that Neo customers matched their target profile very well. Another example, if we move on to the next slide, has to do with AB InBev, the company that makes Budweiser. Now, I mentioned one specific example before, but just to show that they're going after the prospect of working with Chinese innovative companies in a highly systematic way. And again, 2020 was the trigger, I think, as I mentioned, the Xi Jinping announcement about 2030, 2060 really catalyzed a lot of action. And so they have this program that they call the 100+ Innovation Lab. They work with an organization called Impact Hub. Impact Hub, if you're not familiar with it, is actually a global network of, you might call accelerators or ecosystem support organizations that focus primarily on social enterprises. China has one, which is based in Shanghai, and the Social Impact Shanghai organization helps AB InBev to run this program. And each year they have been identifying startups, usually, in China that are working on solutions that relate to AB InBev's strategic imperatives. So, for example, managing water effectively for a beer company is important and has very strong sustainability implications, but climate change is another. And here, a very striking example of a Chinese company that they ended up working with is one that combines expertise in sort of big data with expertise in renewables and helps them to optimize the way in which they use solar energy as well as existing more conventional sources of energy in breweries, and ultimately led to 2 of their breweries in China being carbon neutral. And so this is another very good example of how a Western company has been able to do things much more rapidly in China by tapping into some of the innovation. And these 2 examples also highlight some of the areas in which China is particularly strong, EVs and solar, respectively. Now, clearly, there's pushback from the West. There's a sense in which some of these companies may have had an unfair advantage in terms of subsidies and so on. And I think that's a very legitimate discussion. But the fact of the matter is, you do have access to these solutions in China at the moment, and Western companies that are committed to the market, that are remaining embedded, are seeing important possibilities of harnessing that. On the next slide, I just want to highlight what this is ultimately pointing to is that if China is to be part of the climate solution, then really what we're talking about is Western companies are needing to be willing to work with partners. Now, on the one hand, this is an old story. Any company doing business in China really does need to work with local partners. But I think the couple of nuances to the argument that we're trying to offer is, one, here we're talking about climate action, working towards a greener future. And so perhaps there are choices that have to be made to go against the current tide of negativity around China, for which there may well be legitimate reasons. There could be understandable reluctance to engage on in certain areas. But perhaps it's important to think about putting aside differences when there is as big and important a challenge as climate change, and then looking for partners becomes important. And as already mentioned, it's not just about finding the right partner, but also the right set of partners. And so the fundamentals that one would normally think about, complementarity of skills, commonality of values, would still hold true, but one might need to do this even a bigger group with a greater sense of coalition. Tapping
Shameen?
co-ethnic, yeah?
Yeah, we have about 5-6 minutes left, and want to see if we can also squeeze in a question. So.
Oh, okay. So maybe let me just finish with this. Tapping co-ethnic ties, I think this is also very important in terms of the availability of the Chinese diaspora outside. Trial and error learning in the sense that not all of these examples like Budweiser, which is doing a lot of interesting work, happened overnight. This has built up over time. And also the fact that business is both transactional and relational in China. And the final thing I also want to mention, which perhaps if it comes up in the Q&A, we can pick up on some more, which is that China is vast, as you know very well, just as the United States is, and different locations, subnational locations within China, have their own relative strengths and will also guide very much what companies will do. So let me stop there and Ravi, over to you for the questions.
Thank you. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. Let me start with maybe the first question, and that is about IP, because this often comes up. In your experience talking to companies, that if you have to either take your IP and take it into China or develop it in China, especially in partnership with local companies, how secure is that IP, and what are you hearing from companies operating in China?
That's a great question. And I think because there is now more and more emphasis on IP within China, Chinese companies have a vested interest in IP protection. I would say some of the established tech companies like Tencent, who are not directly related to climate tech, also now have a reputation for managing IP well. And so when they created a coalition focusing on green, it's called the Alliance for Green Technology or something like that, because even though they are not a direct climate tech player, they're interested to use their access to data, their digital technologies to be relevant to climate change issues. And then they have invited other companies to come in and work with them, even their competitors like Alibaba or Microsoft. And I doubt my company like Microsoft would join in unless they were comfortable on the IP front. But then again, not every company is necessarily operating at that high level of standards. And so it is important to also be careful. And so I think the approach that LanzaTech takes, which is to manage that IP pretty tightly, they develop their IP outside of China and then license it within China and also claim ownership of any new IP that's developed in China. I think that approach is also extremely important. So I would not assume that IP is a hopeless situation by any stretch of the imagination. And I would also adopt safeguards in the way that LanzaTech has.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. My question has to do with the pitch for Western multinationals, investors that you described as being somewhat affected by this greater reluctance to engage with China, possibly for government-related matters, tensions that you discussed. So how has the pitch for these companies changed? You talked about it's the right thing to do, right, vis-a-vis climate change, for them to engage again, invest again in China, bring their technology. But what's the upshot for them beyond the moral argument that is certainly an important one?
So basically, if you're selling into China, I think the argument is a simple economic one. Honeywell, for example, sees its sustainability technology as a big source of growth going forward, Bosch as well. So, I mean, to me, on that front, it's relatively straightforward. If there is still reluctance on the part of these companies, well, then that's ultimately their choice. But I think actually so for example, Honeywell bringing in sustainable aviation fuel, I think for them it's primarily a matter of economics. The question about tapping into the innovation, again, I really think, if companies find access to better, especially global companies, I mean, their big advantage is they're able to search globally. And if they find very good technology in different parts of the world, they should tap that technology wherever that is. But there are certain areas around climate tech where China clearly has made very strong strides. And so, again, from a company point of view, I think that, again, it really comes down to whether it makes sense for them or not. But let me also add, I see a very big difference between American companies and European companies. And I think there is a much greater openness on the part of European companies to engage. And again, my view is, work within your appetite and do whatever makes sense. This month, I've had 2 invitations from German companies broadly related in the automotive sector. And they just wanted some advice on how to engage with Chinese startups. And they're not doing it because they're trying to be nice or doing it with a moral imperative. They are scared about the future of their industry, and they see important developments happening in China. To me, ultimately, that is really the pitch. But in the end, companies need to do what they are comfortable with, and I can certainly see greater reluctance on the part of American companies than European companies. And I hope I didn't come across as trying to convert or anybody's point of view. I'm just presenting what I see as an opportunity, but also the importance of doing it with suitable care.
Hi, so both Western, like China, are like interdependent on the action towards like climate. Is there any scope of like realization of by both the parties, like without direct confrontation, which is at like in the tipping point at present, or will it still persist like till 2030 or 2035, which by the time like when we will realize or like we will witness the effects of the climate crisis?
It's hard to know. I think the general view in China is whatever happens in November in terms of the presidential elections, there is going to be tension with the US for the foreseeable future. That's now driving other decisions that are being made here about trying to become more self-reliant in technology around semiconductors, so on and so forth. So overall, I would say, particularly vis-a-vis the US, the prognosis isn't great. I think, though, within that climate of tension, there are also, as I was trying to say in my previous response, I think a good business case for why engaging with China is potentially important for innovation that is related to climate change. And I think actually it will get translated into action by specific decisions that organizations make. The appetite to do that differs, but I think a lot of it, but there's evidence that will continue. And the world is bigger than the US as well. And I see a lot of promise in terms of Europe, where I think the debate has been a little bit more mature. And there are also very interesting things happening out of Southeast Asia. And so it could also be the case that we will see some, kind of detours happening, some workarounds happening, and companies engagement between Western and Chinese companies happening out of Singapore, for example. So there are many Chinese companies that are relevant to sustainability, broadly defined, that are changing their passport, if you will, and becoming Singaporean companies, partly to sort of ease the path to collaboration. And so I think my greatest faith is in the entrepreneurial behavior of individuals and companies And I think, there is important payoffs that will drive collaboration going forward. But actually, I'm not super optimistic that the overall mood music will change anytime soon, particularly between China and the US.
Thank you, Shameen. I'm afraid our time is up. We could go on much longer. But I think you've drawn our attention to the risks of engaging with China have to be weighed against the risks of not engaging with China. And that's a tough issue to deal with. But I think you've given us some sense of the factors to think about in making that choice. And as you say, it depends on individual companies, may also depend on the region from which those companies hail. So with that, I think we conclude the session. Shameen, thank you so much for speaking to us from Shanghai.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.